At its core, the humanitarian system is built on the idea that our shared humanity is what compels us to act. But in today's digitally disrupted, politically fraught, financially constrained world, are we really living up to that ideal? The question, where is the human in humanitarianism, focuses on looking beyond the numbers, beyond the institutions, to confront the ethical dilemmas, the inconvenient truths, the underpinnings of what the system is. Who is it for? Who holds the power? Who are the voices that shape the priorities? Who makes the decisions? Whose voices are those that are ignored or marginalized? And it's critically important now to be thinking about this because the aid system is fighting a crisis of legitimacy as we witness the dehumanizing slaughter and destruction in the Middle East and the worst level of food insecurity ever recorded in Sudan, while governments, paramilitaries, armed groups all flout international law. And all this is happening while the sector itself is grappling with an uncertain future. As Joey said, this conference was the theme of this conference was put on before the U.S. aid cuts. And although we're used to kind of wringing our hands every so often to say, are we doing enough? Are we effective? Are we impactful? These discussions these days seem more existential, more foundational, as much about the relevance of our purpose as it is about the institutions and our actions. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for bearing with the heat and being here. It's nice and cool in this room. I'm still a little bit hot from traveling here, but I'll cool down. I'm Christina Bennett, CEO of Start Network, and I am delighted to be here. So I won't be able to answer all of the questions I've just posed to you right now. They're pretty existential, but I'm excited that you and I are going to have this conversation today and that you will continue that conversation throughout the afternoon. I'm hoping that you keep some of these foundational questions in your mind as you go through your discussions. But maybe first a little bit about Start Network so that you understand where it is I am coming from. So we're a membership of 145 local, national, and international civil society organizations working in humanitarian aid across 6 continents and operating through 10 locally led hubs. And our diversity is by design. We're not just an international network. We're not just a local network. We believe that by bringing all manners of humanitarian aid, all types of organizations in civil society together, we represent the best of what humanitarianism has to offer to confront the complexities of today's crises. But while we are diverse, we are common in our frustration with the way that aid is delivered, the way it's resources, the way it's practiced. We believe that the humanitarian system needs a rethink, and we are united in our desire for system-level change. Currently, we believe the humanitarian system is too centralized, too reactive, too fixed in its outdated ways. It's been operating the same for like the past century. Meanwhile, the world around us has changed so dramatically. We believe we must be more locally led, more anticipatory, more proactive in our funding, and more modern, flexible, and anti-colonial in the way that we work. And we try as Start Network to demonstrate how we do that. We don't just talk about it, we demonstrate how. We practice working differently and model the change that we want to see so that others can adapt their ways, can look at us and look at what we've gone through. We evidence our change, we export that learning to others for others to be able to change and to scale. So before I reflect on the future of aid, which is sort of the topic here, I just want to take us back to the here and now and the present and really discuss a little bit about the current trends that are shaping the current conversations. And many of the financial trends I'll put up here are from a report called the Global Humanitarian Assistance Report. It was just released, this year's report just released last week at ECOSOC in Geneva, hot off the press. It is a go-to resource for all humanitarian financing trends. I always have it on my desk or on my desktop and refer to it often. So yeah, if you haven't read it, please do. In any case, the total number of people requiring humanitarian assistance is now at 323 million. That is slightly down from last year. Last year was about 400 million, but it is double from what it was 10 years ago. Most of the people that make up that need are living in contexts that have been in emergency for more than 5 years. This represents a significant shift in the last decade. In 2014, only 29% of humanitarian caseload was in these so-called protracted crises. In 2024, this had reached 91%. The world is experiencing a surge in violence not seen in the post-World War II era. 2024 marked a grim new milestone, with the highest number of state-based armed conflicts seen in over decades. A staggering 61 conflicts recorded across 36 countries last year. And the authors of this report, taken from PRIO, asserted this is not just a spike in conflicts. This is a structural shift. The world today is far more violent, far more fragmented than it was a decade ago. But while much of the humanitarian spend and much of the humanitarian caseload has to do with conflicts, it is climate risks that are driving the most human suffering and the biggest driver of humanitarian crisis we see today. Climate change mitigation and adaptation have so far not been effective, and scientists agree that we are now in an era of loss and damage. So that sharp end of the stick, we've gone through mitigation, adaptation, we're now in loss and damage, and that's where the humanitarian action comes in. According to an IIED study that we commissioned at START Network, loss and damage from climate change will amount to 10 times the size of the global humanitarian sector budget by 2030, and that will increase to 50 times by 2050. And almost all of these events are small to medium size. So you're not going to read them in the news. They're not going to be on your news feeds. They are the stuff that you don't hear about, but cumulatively, they make up the bulk of human suffering. Funding, the ever popular topic. Record cuts began in 2024. Funding was in decline even before the news of January, February, March of this year. International humanitarian assistance fell by 11% in 2024, nearly $5 billion US, the largest cut ever recorded. And this marks a clear departure from the trend since the early 2010s of a steady and substantial climb in humanitarian aid. You'll see this here. It had seen volumes of aid doubling between 2011 and 2017, peaking at $46 billion in 2022, mainly driven by funding provided for the conflict in Ukraine. And crises are chronically underfunded. The gaps between needs and available resources remain wide. 2024 was the second largest gap on record, 49%. And all those countries, those 91% of those countries that are in protracted crises that I showed you before, they are the most vulnerable because actually countries experiencing protracted crises are now reliant on humanitarian assistance and not development aid from ever before. So the fact that humanitarian aid is being cut means that all of those development aids are rolling back, and those protracted crises will suffer even more than your average short-term humanitarian context. Most humanitarian funding comes from few donors. I mean, this is a pretty dramatic slide. This is 2024, so this is before the US aid cuts. But as you can see, the US is by far the largest humanitarian donor, but there are also just a very small number of humanitarian donors in general. The EU, the US, Germany, the EC provided more than 80% of the funding in 2024. And looking back, how could we not see how vulnerable we were to the whims of the political agenda of a single government? It's right up there on the slide. But also, funding is channeled through very few institutions. Even though the volumes of funding have changed over the years, the channels have remained largely the same. This is the kind of permafrost that we're kind of all in. Looking at the bigger picture, donors continue to provide the bulk of their funding, 61% to multilateral organizations, the UN, for example, and international NGOs at 18%. And the direct funding, as many of you probably know, is sort of implemented through implementing partners. There's this big sort of long humanitarian supply chain. But the fact that this sort of colored line stops at a certain point on this slide and the rest is grayed out means that despite hundreds of processes to try to get to a better understanding, more transparency of the way that funding is delivered, we still do not know who those second level recipients are and how much money actually gets on the ground. In this day and age, that is something that it's quite scandalous, actually. And here we have 2025, donors retreat. Between January and March, USAID had terminated 83% of its contracts, moving some of them actually over to the US State Department. And that US State Department has also cut their funding by 84%. So the picture in the US looks grim. But then in February, we also had UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer reducing UK international aid 0.2%. From 0.5 to 0.3% by 2027. The Netherlands will cut 3.4 billion euros by 2027, and other donors, Germany, Belgium, the EU, Switzerland, have also announced cuts beginning in 2025. With the reductions announced for 2025, public funding available for humanitarian aid could shrink between 34 and 45% by the end of this year. That's rewinding between 8 and 11 years of progress and increased funding in the sector. And the GHA report that I mentioned earlier actually provides some really helpful comparisons. So what I just said was funding was going to contract 34 to 45% in the next year. But to compare this, the Ukrainian economy declined. The Ukrainian economy shrank 28% during the conflict there, and the UK economy shrank 20% during COVID. So 34% is a financial crisis in the humanitarian sector. Are we good? And the dismantling and defunding of USAID in particular has sent shockwaves across the sector, hollowing out humanitarian aid organizations and crippling their work. So at Start Network, we've conducted 2 surveys of our 145 members since the cuts to understand their impact. Close to 70% of our members have been affected by the USAID cuts, and their funding on average has been reduced by 30%. The information we collected tracks information collected by OCHA, by the NEAR network, by ICFA, other sort of humanitarian networks. So this seems to be the average. And the crisis isn't just about funding levels, but also liquidity. Organizations aren't able to cover their immediate expenses. According to another survey we participated in with the Humanitarian Financing Forum here in the UK, about 80% of NGOs have less than 20 months worth of cash flow available to them now. And more than 75% are using or do not have reserves, sort of savings, to be able to sustain their organizations in bad times. This is resulting in suspended programs, unpaid staff, and compromised aid delivery. And as you can imagine, the operational capacity of the sector has been completely damaged. 12,000 humanitarian staff contracts have been canceled. 28% of INGOs and 26% of local NGOs were forced to close at least one office, and organizations reported an average of 33% reduction in geographic coverage, creating what we're calling humanitarian deserts in certain regions. And the effects on crisis-affected communities are already being felt. The impact of the Trump administration's actions alone cannot be underestimated. The Center for Global Development estimates that U.S. assistance saved on average 3.3 million lives per year. UN agencies have predicted pandemic-like impacts on women and girls. In Afghanistan, the health cluster reported 400 clinics have been suspended or closed. Cuts to development programs have also been devastated. The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, you may know it as PEPFAR, has been shut down. And this could lead to about 1 million new HIV infections by 2030. According to the organization Impact Counter, by early June, the cuts to the aid programs by the Trump administration alone had already led to 300,000 deaths. Meanwhile, the sector still struggles with key reforms. Do you remember the Grand Bargain? Do you remember the World Humanitarian Summit? These reforms have been going on a long time. we have been unable to internalize what we've all committed to. We know the changes that we need to make. We are just not incentivized to make them. Localization is backsliding. Funding to local and national actors is not increasing despite many years of sustained advocacy, donor commitments, and policy reform. In 2024, direct funding to local and national actors fell by 31%, or just 3.6% of the total humanitarian spend. But as we all know, localization isn't just about money. It's not just about funding flows. It's about power differentials between local and international organizations. And localization proponents, including, the international humanitarian sector, have done little to shift or even consider what those entrenched power dynamics look like in country, in local organizations, in local societies. In some cases, we have inadvertently actually reproduced the very power inequalities that we are aiming to dismantle. In a study conducted by one of my colleagues in Yemen, local leaders, often positioned as intermediaries for us, the internationals, were reported to misuse the authority granted to them. In Aden, for example, some local leaders were described as pursuing their personal interests and agendas, showing favoritism toward their own tribes, friends, and family. One respondent to our survey characterized this dynamic as a betrayal from within. So localization and power dynamics don't just exist between international and local, but among local to local, national to local. It's sort of human nature, but by not recognizing those power dynamics exist, we are not addressing them. And despite climate being a primary driver of needs, only a small amount of overseas development assistance is used to pay for disasters. And this is largely geared to response. OECD data shows that only 11% of ODA goes to disaster-related activities. This leaves only 50 cents on the dollar spent on disaster prevention and preparedness. More than half of the finance provided following a disaster, for example, from the World Bank or the IMF, were loans rather than grants. This has implications for highly indebted countries who are vulnerable to those disasters. It is not surprising that things like anticipatory action and prearranged financing are more concentrated in middle-income countries and not those fragile states, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. And despite growing interest and support for anticipatory action, prearranged financing available for it has stagnated. The volumes of disbursements have fell, although the activations for anticipatory action are increasing. So I think the mindset shift is happening to be more preemptive, more proactive, but the funding levels are not there to match. What about our principles? They're under attack. Our humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence have been blatantly disregarded and in some contexts instrumentalized to pursue conflict and inflict suffering on populations. Conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine are throwing up a lot of the discussion around the principle of neutrality in general. In the Middle East, there have been profound disagreements between humanitarian leadership and staff in organizations like UNRWA, who question whether or not we can be neutral in a situation like Gaza, where there are daily, consistent violations of IHL by Israel. I was talking to a local START Network member in Ukraine a couple of months ago, and she pointedly said to me in a meeting, "I'm sorry, as a local Ukrainian organization, do you really expect me to act neutrally when my country has been invaded? We will never be neutral. We are firmly on the side of Ukraine." This has struck to the heart of the legitimacy of the humanitarian enterprise and perceptions of humanitarian work. This is translated into attacks against us, not only the work that we do, but as us as individuals. Already in 2025, 128 aid workers have been killed after a record 380 deaths in 2024. And we are struggling with some foundational dilemmas. What is humanitarian action? Is our narrow definition of what humanitarianism is as short-term relief, is that still relevant? We just saw from the statistics that most crises are never short-term. Community needs go beyond mere survival. So should we be redefining our scope to include something that includes building community resilience, building community well-being? Should we be looking for a new form of resistance humanitarianism humanitarianism that's not based on these principles of neutrality and independence, but based on fundamental human rights and principles, for example, of solidarity. As we ask ourselves about enlarging the scope of humanitarian assistance, discussions in Geneva a couple of weeks ago were all about shrinking humanitarian assistance, a back to basics approach, and hyper prioritization. So these conversations are very much live. And who is a humanitarian these days? We've got insurance companies, we've got tech companies, we've got local human rights organizations, we've got environmentalists. They're all active in crisis settings right now. They are determining who is at risk, they are determining who needs assistance, and they are determining how. So I know later on today you're going to be discussing artificial intelligence, and the possibilities of AI are many. AI has proven really useful for cutting down on these mundane humanitarian tasks like beneficiary lists, generating initial sort of situation reports. And more exciting, perhaps, is the way that AI language capabilities have leveled the playing field. At Start Network, we've been able to use AI to hold meetings in 5 languages, whether online or in person. And it's for our global membership, and it's not costing us as much as it would have been a few years ago. Also leveling the playing field is the fact that a local staff member used AI to analyze a video of arriving refugees from Lebanon. Within minutes, artificial intelligence estimated approximately 2,000 people were on the move, a task that would have taken much, much longer through traditional humanitarian analytical means. This wasn't just faster, though. This information from AI was actionable. It was actionable intelligence that allowed the humanitarians working in that context to immediately respond. It also turned out to be accurate. At the end of the day, it was 2,300 people that crossed the line. So it was pretty accurate. At Start Network, we're also playing around with using AI primarily to improve our predictive analytics around disasters, around climate-related hazards, but also around conflicts to transform our version of community protection from reactive to one of proactivity and anticipation. But of course, as we all know, there are also risks in AI. There's voice cloning, AI error that may lead to human harm, strain on stretched budgets where we're spending on maybe explorations of artificial intelligence when money could be going to affected communities. Or one risk is just the fact that AI is really poorly understood and its applications unregulated in our particular sector. In one of its pitch videos, Palantir, a software company and a major US military and aid contractor, used a chatbot to order drone reconnaissance and generate several plans of attack. In that example, who is responsible for violations of international law? Is it the military? Is it Palantir? Is it the chatbot? Who is the actor here for IHL? We haven't really delved into that very much just yet, but I leave it to you to sort out how to manage this in your next sessions, because I know you'll be talking about it. And finally, humanitarianism is proving to be ineffective. No doubt humanitarians are all doing great work around the world. And, I was an aid worker. Everybody is trying to do their very best, doing more with less, under constrained political environments and with constrained resources. But in too many places, traditional humanitarian aid is under-delivering. It is shocking and shameful that in Sudan, half of the population is hungry and 750,000 people are experiencing famine. Meanwhile, in places like Sudan, communities are taking matters into their own hands. They're self-organizing. There's an article about the Sudan emergency response rooms. You may have heard of them. They've become a little bit famous and now have a bunch of funding. These sort of hastily formed networks were formed via WhatsApp. And now there are 700 of them rapidly coordinating for evacuations, food distribution, medical assistance, and more. So while we're all wringing our hands about what is the future of aid, people in communities are just getting on with it. So after a few months of confusion and contraction and soul searching after the announcement of aid cuts, work has begun in earnest to redraw and reform the humanitarian system. But much of the conversation happening around that reform of the system has been largely about self-preservation, albeit at a reduced scale. For example, in March, Tom Fletcher, the emergency relief coordinator, launched the Humanitarian Reset, a 10-point plan aimed mostly at reforming UN bureaucracy. Among the positive aspects of this 10-point plan is priority will be given to funding local and national actors, including through pooled funds. That's great news for me because I run a few pooled funds at Start Network. They're also going to focus on triaging and prioritizing only the most needy and only life-saving action. Again, is that responding to those statistics we saw earlier? And it will be pooling resources for common services, air bridges, needs assessment, data gathering, particularly if that frees up money for other delivery. But at that time, we criticized Tom Fletcher for this 10-point plan. It was rushed. It was primarily concerned with cost cutting. It wasn't strategic. It was reactive. It felt technocratic, incremental, focused on improvements to the UN in the current system rather than questioning the purpose of the system itself. Isn't this an opportunity that we should be taking up? The last thing we thought was that it wasn't inclusive enough. It was a little coterie of UN bureaucrats that came up with this 10-point plan. But as you saw on the last slide, it's not those bureaucrats that are doing the bulk of aid. What happened to listening to communities? What happened to bringing in local voices and local organizations? So fast forward to the Humanitarian Reset Part 2 in June, a couple of weeks ago, when Tom Fletcher again met with his sort of interagency standing committee to bring greater clarity to the reset. He put a little bit more meat on the bones here. So basically, out of the 323 million people that are in need, the UN is going to concentrate on 114 of the most needy. So really hyper prioritizing with a specific focus on women and girls. They're going to devolve decision-making more to humanitarian coordinators and resident coordinators who have more decision-making authority in country. They're going to target humanitarian. They've asked that 50% of humanitarian funding go to pooled funds and 70% of that funding go to local organizations. They demand an unequivocal upholding of the principles, humanitarian principles, and the consistent compliance and application of IHL. So when we reacted to this statement, we were pretty pleased with it. Tom Fletcher did hit all the right notes, according to what we believe needs to be done. But more fundamentally, how is this reform going to be enacted? We've talked about this for years. By whom is this reform going to be enacted? Systematically incorporating the views of those who have been excluded from humanitarian reform initiatives in the past, namely communities, local organizations. That is essential, but there was no talk of that here. More importantly, though, the humanitarian trends I've just talked about and these reset conversations that have just happened point to some inconvenient truths. And this is where I want to start thinking about the future of our aid sector. Inconvenient truths. The first, international humanitarian system has lost its legitimacy and, frankly, to me, its pathos. Political leaders and their governments, public constituencies, and people that we aim to serve all do not believe in the humanitarian endeavor anymore. One only needs to look at the situations in Gaza and Ukraine and Sudan for evidence of our failed politics, our failed investments, our failed narratives in the face of destruction, starvation, and mass atrocities. Second, this has been happening for some time. Financial contributions, as we saw, have been in decline. Humanitarian principles have been discarded. International cooperation and coordination is a theory, not a practice. This shift has been a long time coming. The current cuts have merely brought it into sharp relief. The humanitarian financing system operates as an oligopoly by and for a select few, making large amounts of finance susceptible to political priorities and decisions made in a small number of donor countries. Humanitarian funding is also deeply bilateralized, dependent on the close relationships between organizations and their benefactors, breeding deep codependency, budget inflation, competition, and conflicts of interest in assessing needs, monitoring risks, and monitoring outcomes. And unlike multilateral development finance, like the World Bank IDA, for example, which is mostly, which goes through regular replenishment processes, the humanitarian system, the humanitarian financing levels have no system-wide mechanism for aligning financial commitments, political will, and policy objectives. It's left entirely at the discretion of individual donors. The humanitarian financing system has not been inclusive enough, failing to recognize, as we saw in the last slides, that humanitarian action is not the most significant factor in how people in crisis receive support. International actors must recognize that local humanitarian thrives with or without them. That's remittances, volunteerism, community self-help groups. They make up the bulk of humanitarian response and even humanitarian financing. They are continuing to operate while the rest of us are throwing up our hands in chaos today. So while localization has been about the acceleration of external funding flows, little attention has been paid to the importance of supporting organizations where they are, building their own independent resources and autonomy. Our system reforms have not been deep enough nor fast enough to rectify the sector's inherent flaws. Reforms that threaten the balance in power and control of resources are quickly neutralized. Everybody says all the right things in the room, but they're quickly put under the carpet. Take the humanitarian reset. Does that form of humanitarianism really respond to everything that we've just been talking about? It is more concerned with the institutions than our first principle, humanitarian principle of humanity. For me, the biggest risk of the humanitarian reset is that it pulls us into bureaucratic drag. Finally, the humanitarian architecture needs a reset. The humanitarian system needs a reset in the true sense of the word, a reboot, a return to factory settings, starting again with the re-examine of the sector's power imbalances, financial flows, incentive structures, and business models. And finally, we continue to suffer from a collective action problem. I've been talking about this. We commit all the time, boldly, in groups, the Grand Bargain, the World Humanitarian Summit, yet we fail to cooperate through action. Everyone else is waiting for someone else to make the same move. We know what to do. We just don't do it because our incentives are misaligned and we're waiting for someone to jump first. The Grand Bargain was the perfect opportunity for this. It had everyone in the room, the UN, the donors, the Red Cross movement, local NGOs, international NGOs, some community members, everyone in the room. But all they did was point to each other as the source of the problem and also the first step in the solution. So nothing so far has gotten principally done. So we cannot ignore these inconvenient truths. Reimagining and rebuilding a more inclusive and effective system requires us to challenge. You talked about challenge in the opening. Challenge the values, challenge the assumptions, challenge the incentives that underpin humanitarian action today. So what could a reformed humanitarian system look like, in my mind? And this is based on what Start Network's research over the years, some research I did at ODI before my current role. Here is a thought experiment I would like to put to you today. 1, humanitarian action becomes a networked core of local and national solutions, where humanitarian needs can be met more locally, more directly, and without intermediaries. It roots all of our work in what communities need and want, irrespective of whether it falls into humanitarian versus development versus security versus human rights buckets. It's all problems that need solving. Start Network has been trying to show what this looks like in practice. We've piloted and scaled approaches to decentralized decision-making to our 145 members, 70% of whom are local and national organizations. We've also tried to reduce the barriers to local organizations' access to finance by putting together a tiered due diligence system that tries to remove some of the bureaucratic barriers that prevent local organizations from receiving funding. So the second part of a new humanitarian system would be an international humanitarian backstop, an international fail-safe. So while the core of humanitarian action is this local first humanitarian system supported by civil society, the international system plays a much more limited role. It plays a role to fill critical gaps when governments are unable or unwilling to organize and uphold their duties as the duty bearers of humanitarian response. International humanitarian actors could also be there to provide scale. If you remember the 2005 Indian Ocean tsunami, it was 5 countries. It was impossible for any single country to cover the needs and the risks in that scenario. That's when you needed the international humanitarian system. And to cultivate and supply specialist technical equipment and expertise. If you need helicopters tomorrow, it's pretty much the international system that's going to give you helicopters tomorrow. So that's what the international system could be used for. Much narrower, much more discrete. In fact, its foundational purpose, the original purpose of what the international humanitarian aid system was meant to do. The third was a shift from responding to needs to protecting from risks. And this should be all very familiar to all of you who are working on disaster risk reduction. The humanitarian system has relied on a reactive model from the start, only mobilizing after a hazard hits and rushing to meet needs only when lives and livelihoods have already been lost. But we know from our research that we've done at Start Network, that more than half of disasters are somewhat predictable and modelable. We have the data, we have the tools, and increasingly we have the political will to do things differently. Why would we wait for suffering to happen if we could act ahead of time? But this means shifting our analysis from needs assessments to risk modeling, shifting our ways of working from thinking about reaction to prevention, and pre-positioning financing to ensure that resources are guaranteed and allocated efficiently and rapidly when triggers are met. At Start Network, we've been operating such a mechanism for about 3 or 4 years now. It's called Start Ready, and it is a sort of a platform. It's a risk pool and funding pool that pre-positions funds for civil society organizations to proactively support and protect communities at risk of climate hazards. Through Start Ready, we pool funds from a number of donors, we model and pool risks, we leverage insurance and reinsurance, and in doing so, we can stretch funding up to 2 times, which means that for every pound channeled to the Start Ready mechanism, we can protect 2 pounds worth of people. We can guarantee that 2 pounds worth of people will be protected in the event of a disaster, because we know that not all of those triggers will be met at the same time. Then finally, a diversified and humanitarian financing ecosystem resilient to shocks. Humanitarian action in 2025 requires diverse approaches supported by a wider range of funding instruments and alliances. We need to shift from a charity system dominated and controlled by governments to a financing architecture where governments play a much more specialized role. They support the global public goods. They provide the seed funding to crowd in other sources of funding and financing when needed. They de-risk investments for corporates, for banks, for other financiers, to invest in fragile contexts. We are working, for example, in our 10 locally led hubs to broker those kinds of relationships. I was just in India where we had a panel discussion with our India hub and a bunch of corporates, large corporations in India, to discuss how they could channel money into the India hub to be able to work around AI innovations, to be able to innovate disaster response in many of the flood-affected areas of India. And those corporates, they have corporate social responsibility targets that they have to meet, and the India hub is a perfect recipient for that level of money. So, how to put the human back in humanitarianism? Back to the first question I asked at the beginning. I'm just going to sort of summarize here. First, incentivize the international system to adopt and enable a local first approach, that core of humanitarian action that is all about local enterprise, not the international system running in. Second, shift the international system from serving political interests to becoming a global public good. Enable a portfolio approach to humanitarian financing, considering the range of risks, needs, resilience, not humanitarianism as just short-term response, but humanitarianism as a wider proposition. Strengthen the compliance and use of the foundational humanitarian principles and systems to ensure that international aid is not only effective, but it is also ethical. And rethink how we evidence and communicate effectiveness and impact. And I want to spend a bit of time on this. You're an academic institution. You talked at the beginning about how you want to disrupt, how you want to be bold, how you are the thinkers and the future leaders that are going to change the way we work. So how can you help us ensure that we have the right analysis for a true humanitarian reset? First, we need to understand better how communities are coping with disasters, and how they will even cope and transcend the aid cuts. History has shown us that communities are never passive actors, yet the localization and resilience debates have often affirmed agency of donors over communities because we just don't know enough. How can we do the research, do the analysis to know more? We're also not very rigorous as a humanitarian community in capturing high quality data, sharing that data, and analyzing it. I hope you talk about that later today, whether it's in your AI session or in other sessions. But at the same time, we are persistently focused on using statistically measurable outcomes, smart KPIs, log frames where we have to prove through numbers what we've done and what the impact has been, but often at the expense of understanding the underlying reasons why certain practices have succeeded or failed. Political economy analysis, social network analysis, these are the pieces of analysis that we need to be doing. If we're going to be a local first sector, we need to understand how local dynamics, how political economies function at local level. And then finally, analysis across the sector is still very northern-led. That's why at Start Network, we now have a sort of an internal requirement that anytime we do a piece of analysis, we have to co-define it and co-produce it with local experts, with local communities, with local academic institutions. I don't know if you're doing that here at UCL, but can you? So to conclude, the decisions being made now, whether it's by you in this room and the research that you're doing, whether it's by Tom Fletcher in the Humanitarian Reset, whether it's by the emergency response rooms in Sudan, these are political choices, not technical fixes, that are going to transform the humanitarian system. We need to let go of control. We need to invest in what works. We need to know what works, and we need to choose to resource a future that is already being built. Humanitarianism must be a collective endeavor for all and by all, now more than ever. We need a diverse ecosystem where we can share resources, distribute risk, and respond to ways that are genuinely accountable. So there's been a lot of information I've put in front of you this morning. I urge you to bear this all in mind, at least the themes that I've talked about, as you go through your questions for the rest of the day, and have your discussions on, I believe it's ethics, on new forms of financing, on digital technology and AI. And I also realize that I've painted a bleak picture today, but I urge you to find optimism in your discussions today. I'm an optimist. It's pretty much the only thing that gets me through all of this year after year. And to borrow from a poem I read just after the US election last November, and one I often repeat to myself and to others, I urge you to find optimism, not because the news is good, it's really often not, but because there are good people demonstrating that change is always possible. People like you. So please, be those people demonstrating and catalyzing change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time for just one or two very quick questions. Does anyone have a burning question they would like to go to Christina? If we could get the microphone up to.
Hi, I'm Dr. Christy Shuck-Smith-Wesley from the University of Nottingham. I'm an international law specialist. I just wondered, we were at the UNDRR Global Platform in June, and we heard a lot there as well about diversifying finance for humanitarianism. And I wondered what your thoughts are on how you square that with the principles, because it seems like depending on where the money is coming from, the neutrality, independence, cooperation, etc., might be a challenge. But obviously I understand it's essential that we find money from somewhere. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that. Thank you.
Should I answer that? Or do you want to take one more?
Are there any other burning questions? One here, yep.
All right, so my name is Per Becker. I work at Lund University in Sweden. So to what extent do you think the ongoing sort of implosion of the humanitarian sector is the result of poorly managed complex problems, or the outcome of some sort of political agenda that somebody's pushing.
Okay. So maybe on the first question, there is no clean money. So we have all of these conversations in our own in Start Network all the time. We have 20 donors, and show me one of those donors that doesn't have some. We try to accept money that aligns with our values, but look into any single one of those donors, and there's something that's not going to match up. So money donorship is always going to be politically charged. But this is the idea that I was trying to put forward of humanitarianism, and particularly humanitarian financing of the traditional donors as a global public good. So right now, donors, the UN puts out an appeal. The donors fund what they want to fund. They fund it based on their own political strategic priorities. They fund it based on where they have offices or embassies, and they fund it based on what the minister wants that particular month. And so things get funded unevenly and generally, 49% underfunded. What if we move to almost like sort of the World Bank replenishment model, or the model that Gavi uses, the Global Vaccine Alliance, or the Global Fund for AIDS? This is a giant pooled fund for donors, for many donors, that is governed by an independent board. So the allocations of those funds are not governed by the donor. The donors don't get to pick and choose where their money is spent. They pool the money, they replenish it. There's an expectation of replenishment every year. And the decisions made about how and where that money is spent is made by an independent board. Some of them will be on that board, but that rotates out. So this is an idea that was put forward by the Center for Global Development a few years ago. The model is there. Why don't we use it? Especially now when we have so little ODA, can't we just ring fence it and put it into this fund for the neediest cases, the most marginalized cases, the most politically fraught cases that no climate finance action is gonna fund because it's too sensitive. Put it in this fund where the allocation of funds is determined by needs. So I think it's rethinking about humanitarianism, not as an extension of soft power, but as a global public good. And can't we get back to it? Like, now is the time to do it. We don't have the money for global soft power anymore. So that would be my answer to that one. But yeah, squaring that circle is hard, and governments simply don't want to do it. So, but we have to convince at least a few progressive ones to start somewhere. On the question of the implosion of the humanitarian system. So I guess what I was trying to say, so the implosion of the humanitarian system as of January 2025 was very much dictated by a particular agenda of a particular government and a particular political view of the aid system and of the money that we're spending on what. But I think what I was also trying to say was this was coming for some time, that the sector needed reforming for years. We've been talking about it in my entire career, which is too long to even mention, but certainly since 2016, the World Humanitarian Summit, we aren't doing a good job in the eyes of the people we aim to serve. We are not addressing needs in the way that they need to be addressed. We are focused on our own institutions and our own ways of working. Is this humanitarian? Is this development? Oh, depending on what it is, I can or cannot fund it, when you're not looking at the person and what the problems are that they need solving. So I think it's a political economy problem. I think it always has been. The sector has been set up to favor the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, who are also mostly the main, humanitarian donors. It sort of favors the power holders of the post-World War II order. And that power structure hasn't changed. The entire international humanitarian aid system, the UN, is built on the British civil service, because that was the best model we had. But is the British civil service, with all due respect to people from FCDO in the room, is that really the model of working, of operating that we want to use today? The world has moved on. There are many more sources of good management and good leadership and local ingenuity that we can pull from, and not operate the whole thing as a civil service. So I think if we were to do an analysis of the incentive structures of who is winning and who is losing in all of this, and redraw that political economy, redraw the funding flows, redraw who those power flows, we would get to something that is a little more effective. Because at the end of the day, we can do really good work. We do really good work. We just don't do it enough of the time in the right way. We don't get the right things in the hands of the right people at the right time.